Imagine waking up in a world where everything you knew, your home, your family, your freedoms, was on the verge of destruction. A world where the air is thick with tension and the sound of angry mobs is a daily occurrence. You live in a country where revolution is underway, and with it, hopes for equality and freedom. But for many, this promised freedom turned into a nightmare. Now, picture yourself as a woman during this time. You're living in a period of mass unrest, where women, once considered secondary in society, have suddenly become a focal point. You fought for change, for freedom, for justice, but now you find yourself imprisoned, facing brutality at the hands of those who once promised liberty and equality. What happened to these women? What horrors did they face? And why are their stories so often overlooked in history? In this video, we are going to uncover the horrifying fate of female prisoners during the French Revolution, a chapter of history that remains one of the most tragic and neglected. You might be familiar with the famous names like Marie Antoinette, but there were thousands of women whose fates were just as cruel, if not more so, and their suffering is something we need to remember. So stick around as we dig deeper into this shocking and heart-wrenching story. By the end of this video, you'll understand the true cost of revolution for the women caught in its destructive path. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, wasn't just a political upheaval. It was a complete transformation of the social, economic, and cultural fabric of France. The revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, demanding liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. These were powerful, noble ideas, but the path to realizing them was anything but peaceful. The revolution quickly descended into violence and chaos. As the old world order collapsed, the new order of the revolutionaries was built on suspicion, fear, and bloodshed. The Reign of Terror, which took place between 1793 and 1794, was perhaps the darkest period in the revolution. During this time, anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution was arrested, tried, and often executed without mercy. But what happened to the women who were caught up in this wave of terror? Were they just victims of circumstance, or was their fate even more brutal because of their gender? Women had always played a vital role in French society, but during the revolution, they became increasingly involved in public and political life. Some were supporters of the revolution, while others were conservative, fighting to preserve the monarchy. Some, like Alain de Gouges, took on roles as political writers and thinkers, while others took to the streets to protest and demand change. Women even participated in armed uprisings, marching to Versailles in 1789 to demand food and bring the king back to Paris. However, as the revolution began to unravel and become more radical, women found themselves in a dangerous position. The revolutionary leaders started seeing them as potential threats, labeling them as counter-revolutionaries or enemies of the state, simply because of their ties to the old ways or because they spoke out too loudly for the changes they wanted to see. And as political factions splintered, the women who had once been the loudest voices for change found themselves silenced or punished. The prisons were filled to capacity with female prisoners who were suspected of being against the revolution. But why were so many women targeted? The answer lies in the nature of the revolution itself. The leaders of the revolution, particularly Robespierre and the Jacobins, were trying to consolidate power. The National Convention, which had overthrown the monarchy, had to deal with uprisings, foreign invasions, and internal dissent. To maintain control, they began a ruthless campaign against anyone who could be seen as a threat. Women, once active participants in the revolution, were now seen as symbols of the old regime, the aristocracy, or even as distractions from the men's political goals. The prisons of Paris and other cities became overcrowded with female prisoners, many of whom were arrested without any clear charges. Women who were simply accused of being royalists or sympathizers with the monarchy were thrown into filthy, overcrowded cells, sometimes without ever being formally charged. These prisons were already bursting with political prisoners, and the women were often left to fend for themselves in horrific conditions. Prison conditions were not just uncomfortable, they were deadly. Many of the prisoners, particularly women, suffered from disease and malnutrition. There was barely enough food to go around, and the women were forced to share small, dark cells, often sleeping on the cold, hard floor. The stench of decay and illness filled the air, and the constant fear of death loomed over every prisoner. Disease like typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread quickly in the overcrowded cells, making survival nearly impossible. But the physical suffering was only part of the horror. For these women, their very existence was a symbol of the old ways they were fighting to escape. They were seen as traitors, enemies of the revolution, and often treated as such. The humiliation they endured was part of the revolution's effort to break their spirits. The revolutionaries used imprisonment as a way to torture these women psychologically. For months, many of the women were kept in the dark, their lives in constant limbo. They had no idea when or if they would be executed. Women who had once fought for liberty and justice were now left to face the terrible uncertainty of their fate. And yet, the ultimate cruelty was a trial. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to rid France of enemies of the revolution, had no interest in justice. The trials were swift and often unfair. Women who had been arrested were brought before the tribunal, accused of crimes they hadn't committed. Many of them were barely given the opportunity to defend themselves, and their guilt was already assumed. The tribunal would often find the women guilty, and the punishment was swift and brutal. Most of these women were sentenced to death by guillotine. The guillotine, which had become the symbol of the revolution, did not discriminate. It was used on men and women alike. But for women, there was an added level of brutality. Their executions were often made public spectacles, meant to remind the population that no one was above suspicion. The execution of these women was meant to send a message that no one, no matter how noble or respected, was safe from the revolution's wrath. The streets of Paris were filled with the sound of marching feet as women, their hands bound and heads bowed, were led to the guillotine. Some of these women faced death with courage and defiance, while others were filled with terror at the thought of their fate. But what is truly tragic about these women is that they were not just victims of political power struggles. Many of them were mothers, daughters, and sisters who'd been caught in the crossfire of a revolution that promised them a better future. Women like the poet and activist Marie Jean Roland, who was arrested and imprisoned, only to die later in horrific conditions. Or Theroigne de Méricourt, a revolutionary who was once at the forefront of political movements, but was later driven to madness by the abuse she faced in prison. Even those who survived the guillotine were not spared from the trauma of their experiences. Many of the women who were released from prison after the end of the Reign of Terror were left with broken bodies and shattered minds. The emotional and psychological toll of their time in prison, combined with the loss of family and community, left them hollowed out and devastated. Some were never able to recover from the horrors they had witnessed and endured. To truly understand the horror that these women experienced, we need to look closely at the lives they led once imprisoned. Many of the women who found themselves behind bars were, in fact, the very women who had participated actively in the revolution. Women who once fought for liberty, marched through the streets for bread, and who had believed in the promise of a better France. But once the revolution began to turn violent, even these women were no longer seen as allies. As the revolution entered the Reign of Terror, the temperature of fear and suspicion rose to unbearable levels. Revolutionary leaders like Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety launched their campaign against perceived enemies of the state. Anyone, even the most loyal revolutionary, could be accused of being a counter-revolutionary, an enemy of the people, or even a traitor to the cause. For women who had been caught up in the hopes of equality and reform, the consequences were devastating. They were often labeled as enemies simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what really makes the plight of these women so tragic is the fact that many of them had nothing to do with the old regime or counter-revolutionary activities. Many were ordinary women who had no significant political power, yet they were imprisoned and sentenced to die by the same terror they had once hoped to end. They became casualties of the very system they had fought to change. In these prisons, life was unbearable. Female prisoners faced overcrowding, poor sanitation, and constant violence. Diseases spread quickly in the unsanitary conditions. Typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis were rampant, and many prisoners died from these illnesses long before they were even tried for their crimes. The suffering these women endured in prison wasn't just physical. It was psychological as well. Women who had once enjoyed some level of freedom were now reduced to mere numbers in the eyes of the state. Their individual stories, their hopes and dreams, were ignored as they became part of the faceless mass of the enemy. Perhaps one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of their imprisonment was the separation from their families. Some women were arrested with their children, but most were torn from their loved ones. Many mothers never saw their children again. The pain of separation, along with the brutal conditions of imprisonment, left deep emotional scars on these women. For the children who were left behind, the trauma was just as severe. Some were sent to orphanages, never to see their mothers again. Others were forced to live through the trauma of their mother's execution by guillotine. Many of the women, however, were not executed immediately. The waiting game, the prolonged uncertainty of being in prison, was agonizing. The feeling of knowing that the guillotine could come for them at any moment, without warning, without mercy, was a constant threat. Some women spent months, even years, in these horrific conditions, enduring hunger, illness, and mental exhaustion. For the women who did manage to survive, their ordeal did not end with their release. The trauma they had experienced in the prisons left permanent scars on their minds. Many had lost their families, their homes, and their sense of identity. They were often viewed with suspicion by the rest of society, labeled as revolutionary women who had been part of the terror. Even though the reign of terror eventually ended, the stigma attached to these women didn't go away. They were often left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But in a society that had little to offer them, the pain these women endured was not just about physical suffering. It was about the humiliation they faced every day. They were constantly reminded that their lives had no value to the state. Women who were politically active during the revolution were especially targeted. But even those who had simply been in the wrong place or associated with the wrong person could be swept up into the chaos. The revolution's promises of liberty and equality seemed far away for those who found themselves at the mercy of the terror. This sense of powerlessness was compounded by the fact that many of the women had been brave fighters before their imprisonment. Women like Thero and Demericourt, who had been one of the most vocal and active revolutionaries, were captured and taken to prison. She had fought for equality and the right to participate in the revolutionary movement, only to become a victim of the very forces she had once supported. Her imprisonment marked the end of her political career, and she suffered severe emotional trauma from being locked away. It is said that she eventually went mad due to the abuse and neglect she suffered while imprisoned. Some of the female prisoners were able to form bonds in prison, providing each other with some measure of comfort in their darkest hours. Women who had been political activists or had previously led public lives found strength in solidarity. They would share whatever meager food they could find, and they would comfort one another through the long, lonely days. Some even tried to resist their oppressors by staging protests or demanding better treatment. But resistance in such conditions was futile, and many of these women were punished for daring to speak out. Among the most well-known figures in the history of the Reign of Terror is Marie Antoinette, the former Queen of France, who was accused of treason and executed by guillotine. Her execution is often seen as a final act in the revolution's destruction of the monarchy. However, Marie Antoinette's fate wasn't unique. Thousands of other women, from all walks of life, were also executed, their lives cut short by the guillotine. While Marie Antoinette's death was a public spectacle, the execution of the countless other women who were imprisoned, tried, and sentenced to death often went unnoticed. Their names are lost to history, but their deaths were no less painful or unjust. The fact that many of these women were executed not just for their political actions, but for their very gender, makes their fate even more tragic. They were seen not just as individuals with hopes, dreams, and ambitions, but as symbols of the past that the revolutionaries wanted to destroy. These women were guilty not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. It's important to remember that the Reign of Terror did not last forever. After the execution of Robespierre and the fall of the radical faction, the violence eventually subsided. But for many of these women, it was too late. The damage had been done. The trauma they endured during the Reign of Terror left them marked for life. The stories of these women, their suffering, their courage, and their ultimate fate, are often overlooked in the grand history of the French Revolution. But their experiences provide us with a deeper understanding of the true cost of revolution. The French Revolution promised freedom and equality, but for these women, it brought only violence, humiliation, and death. Their voices were silenced by the very people who claimed to fight for their rights. The fate of these female prisoners reminds us that the price of political upheaval is often borne by the most vulnerable members of society. And yet, In their suffering, they showed remarkable resilience. Even in the darkest hours, they fought for their dignity, their families, and their beliefs. We must never forget the stories of these women. Their suffering was not in vain, and their legacy is a powerful reminder of the human cost of revolution. If you learned something new from this video, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. History is full of forgotten stories, and we are here to bring them to light. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.